Hello, I'm David Breeden. I'm the senior minister at First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, and we are a historically humanist congregation. This is Coffee and Wisdom, and each week we go into some subject to think about how these things impact American culture, popular culture, where religious and philosophical ideas come from, where they may be heading in the future. And this week, I want to look at ways of being non-theistically moral. And these ideas, of course, go way back in time. I'm going to call it something that I have a hard time saying, and that is Eupraxsophy, which I say 3 times fast because I can't. But we'll figure out why I can't exactly say that in just a few minutes. Well, it is a term that was coined by a secular humanist, and Paul Kurtz is the first person to take the term secular humanist and really embrace it as a term that could be used in a positive way. He was already a humanist, and when the term was used in a court case in the mid-1960s and then began to be used by right-wing preachers, television evangelists attacking secular humanism, which wasn't a thing. So Paul Kurtz took the term and said, well, guess what? I like it. And we'll look a little bit further into how he dealt with that, even issuing a secular humanist manifesto at one point. But he did come up with this idea that I want to trace a little bit how he came there. He later changed the spelling, by the way, to Eupraxsophy. I'll show you how the etymology is going to be working in just a moment. But the adding of the S does make a difference. Kurtz had this to say: I think we will have to coin a new term in order to distinguish non-theistic beliefs and practices from other systems of beliefs and practices, a term that could be used in many languages. The best approach is to combine Greek roots. And I have come up with the term Eupraxsophy. EU being the term good, or the prefix for good in Greek. Then praxis, we still use that term. It never really became English. And practique, which becomes the term practice in the English language, meaning to do or to embody. And then Sophie, like in philosophy, as wisdom. Philosophy is the love of wisdom. This is good doing wisdom or good practical wisdom, maybe a little bit more English there. But that's the idea that Paul Kurtz was going after, is how to express some kind of a secular way of being that was an affirmative, positive way of life. And here's another of his books called Exuberance and Affective Philosophy of Life. I'll talk later in the week about the foundation that he set up and how to get a hold of some of his books, which are still available. Kurtz had this to say: a Eupraxsophy is a non-religious life stance or worldview, emphasizing the importance of living an ethical and exuberant life and relying on rational methods such as logic, observation, and science, rather than faith, mysticism, or revelation toward that end. So you see exactly where Kurtz is going. We discussed the idea of deism last week, and we saw that the deists were very early, back in the 1600s, rejectors of the idea of revelation from some kind of God out there into the human mind. This is carrying on with this idea as Kurtz is having it. Now, I should mention, and this just came out recently, that Gallup issued the following news release: U.S. church membership falls below majority for the first time. In Coffee and Wisdom, we've talked a lot about this. There has been some speculation that maybe the whole COVID pandemic would bring people in the United States back to some kind of religious practice, despite the fact that the buildings are all closed. But that doesn't seem to be happening. Gallup has this to say: in 2020, 47% of U.S. adults belong to a church, synagogue, or mosque, down more than 20 points from the turn of the century, the turn of the 21st century, and changed primarily due to rise in Americans with no religious preference. Americans' membership in houses of worship continued to decline last year, dropping below 50% for the first time in Gallup's 8-decade trend. In 2020, 47% of Americans said they belong to a church, synagogue, or mosque, down from 50% in 2018 and 70% in 1999. And we've looked at a lot of the trend lines over time, and this indeed is the trend line that the Gallup poll is tracing at the present moment. We've seen this happen over and over again. I've looked at also the decline in liberal Protestantism, especially, as a decline. So now below 50% in terms of actual membership. But of course, we know membership, actually signing on the dotted line and actually going in and, and considering yourself something, are very different things. But it does open up even further, I think, the idea of how do we talk about morality and ethics in a world where, in a nation where traditional Christian thought really isn't the baseline anymore. I will be mentioning this week several books, the writings of Paul Kurtz. There is a collection called Meaning and Value in a Secular Age. There is a book that I'll mention a few times because it's really groundbreaking, that came out 3 or 4 years ago by Tim Whitmarsh, who is a Cambridge professor in the classics. He goes back into Greek philosophy and Greek culture, looking at it once again to read between the lines, and it's called Battling the Gods: Atheism in the Ancient World. And what he teases out is that there was considerably more atheism than people were really willing to be upfront about in ancient, especially Greek and Roman philosophies. And I'll also be talking about how the pre-Christian ideas of morality and ethics have been used and looked back at as a way to get at this future. Pierre Hadot is a French scholar from the 20th century who started out as a Catholic priest, said, that's not for me. He became a philosophy professor in France and wrote a series of books on how ancient philosophy were actually the center of moral and ethical thought anyway, and not the Christians who took over those ideas and then began to change them. So one of his books is What is Ancient Philosophy? And we'll be taking a peek at what he has to say. Where Paul Kurtz got the idea of coming up with a Greek name is the Greek philosophy of eudaimonia. Eudaimonia was what ancient Greek and Roman philosophers were aiming at. Eudaimonia, that was the big idea. Eudaimonia is often mistranslated as happiness. That begins in the late 19th century when especially British translators are working with usually Aristotle and Plato and translating them. And they mistranslate that as the pursuit of happiness. Actually, that mistranslation goes into Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness that Thomas Jefferson wrote about. But it actually means a little bit different, something else. So and we just saw that as good in Greek, and then daemon, that the other term there is demon. So you got a daemon, which is the good spirit, and a demon, which is a bad spirit. So good daemon, the guardian, the genius, the spirit, the soul, something like that. So how to have a good spirit is really what is trying to be translated here. The term just doesn't quite translate, but it literally means human flourishing. It's a contented state of being, happy, healthy, and prosperous. So that's what the ancient Greek philosophers began to talk about, or a contented state of being happy, healthy, and prosperous. So that was the goal of ancient Greek philosophies that we'll talk about a little more this week. Happiness doesn't get at what they were really thinking of as a moral and ethical life stance. Paul Kurtz did say this: the meaning of life is not to be discovered only after death in some hidden, mysterious realm. On the contrary, it can be found by eating the succulent fruit of the tree of life and by living in the here and now as fully and creatively as we can. So that's the word from the guy who embraced the idea of secular humanism back in the 1960s and continued writing into the 1990s. So again, taking that fruit from the tree of life, just as Eve did in the myth of the Garden of Eden, and enjoying what that means of good and of evil. And that's what we're going to be talking about this week. At First Unitarian Society, we have aspirations that are indeed secular in nature. We aspire to live joyfully and ethically in loving, reverent relationship with humanity and nature. So the people of First Unitarian Society have been exploring this idea for a very long time. And we'll be talking about how humanism figures into this movement. Wednesday night, 7 p.m. Central Time, Bibles and Beer. I'll be talking about what not to say to a burning bush. One of the more interesting facts of the Hebrew scriptures is that there is no theological discussion of what God might be. It's just descriptive in stories. The only place where some theology about God occurs is when Moses is speaking to the burning bush. So we want to look at the terminology around that a little bit to see what maybe the ancient Hebrews actually thought about the concept of Yahweh or God. Thanks a lot, and we'll be back tomorrow to talk about the good life. Thanks.